Hey, I'm Brett, and this is the channel Brett and Some Books. Today we're continuing the first Casualty by Philip Knightley. This is Chapter 13, Never Again, 1940 to 1945. It is my earnest hope that a better world shall emerge, a world dedicated to the dignity of man. General Douglas MacArthur, Manila, September 2nd, 1945. There were lots of bodies we never identified. You know what a direct hit by a shell does to a guy? Sometimes all we have is a leg or a hunk of arm. Technical Sergeant Donald Hagwell, 48th Quartermaster, Graves Registration in American Treasury, 1455 to 1955. The last months of 1940 saw Britain facing bankruptcy. She had paid for all her food, munitions, and shipping with cash, but, as Churchill said in a long letter to Roosevelt, the moment was fast approaching when the money would run out. Roosevelt replied with the Land Lease Act, turning the United States into the arsenal of democracy and providing Britain with special credits to buy whatever she needed. The act was a strong indication that the United States would eventually enter the war, and it was clear that when it did, it would be the dominating partner. So with Britain stripped of her major assets, abroad and incurring gigantic debts, her continued existence as a world power from that moment became doubtful. Churchill must have sensed this, and to some extent it explains his obsession with the two areas where Britain would, for a time, still be able to exercise independent command, North Africa and the bombing of Germany. Thus, although for Hitler it was never more a sideshow, the Desert Campaign, for Churchill and the British, the greatest theater of war. It attracted the best war correspondents, produced some of the best writing, and was given a disproportionate amount of space in British newspapers. It threw up more heroes, more household names, and more legends than any other front. It became the most romanticized part of the war, a correspondent's paradise, the last gentleman's campaign. It was certainly true that if a war had to be fought, the North African desert was the place to fight it. The action took place in an empty arena, devoid of those houses, schools, churches, and civilians. Come on! And elsewhere that get in the way of battle. There were few roads, but since the desert provided firm going for most of the time, armies were as free to maneuver as fleets. It was war in its purest form, what Alan Moorhead, there for the Daily Express, called a knight's tournament in empty space. The armies rose to the romantic challenge. Erwin Rommel, the German general, became the Desert Fox. Operations were given names like Crusader. Armored division officers gave orders from their chargers, tanks, or armored cars. Supply trucks moved off to rendezvous point on their order. Lead horses! And an army public relations handout referred to officers sitting in their tanks like sunburnt gods. For the correspondents, the war had everything they could desire. They were free to go wherever they wished. For those who, like Quentin Reynolds, had come straight from the Soviet Union, this was scarcely believable. Stories were there for the asking. Censorship, with some glaring exceptions, was reasonable. Communications were good, and the desert bred a strange spirit of kinship. When Sir Archibald Wavell began his offensive in December 1940, he announced it to 6 correspondents. 18 months later, there were 92, and more were arriving daily. On a personal level, many found the Desert Campaign the most profound experience of their lives. Alan Moorhead has described the deep and lasting friendship that developed between him and his professional rival, Alexander Clifford of the Daily Mail, formerly eyewitness in France. A friendship so intellectually complex that Moorhead frankly admitted, mentally, by the time I was more married to Alex than I was to Lucy. Like most of the time, like other correspondents, Moorhead and Clifford were young and vigorous, and had a sense of history and of the part they were playing in it, as well as the arrogance of the British, still strong in the approaching twilight. We were rich and powerful. We believed that we belonged on a superior race of men. We were constantly moving among colored men whose territory for many years past had been governed by the British. Wherever we went in the Middle East, it remained on what we liked to think of as British soil. Like the children of very wealthy parents, it seemed quite natural to us that we should occupy the best houses and hotels, and that we should have at our command cars, motor launches, servants, and the best of food. On a professional level, correspondents were all absorbed into the military machine without much trouble. The Ministry of Information was beginning to consider war correspondence as an integral and essential part of our fighting activities on land, in the sea, and in the air, and what General Montgomery was later to describe as an element of my staff. Few correspondents resented this. Before going to the Middle East, most had thought a lot about their careers. Should they continue as reporters, or should they enlist? Clifford said that surely the answer was to become a war correspondent, presumably because one continued one's career, but at the same time made a contribution to the war effort. Clifford and others had difficulty in deciding what a correspondent's duty should be. Clifford's strengths as a correspondent, his refusal to be taken in by British propaganda, and his recognition of German strength of purpose, made him pessimistic about Britain's future, and thus more involved in doing his bit to preserve it. Flying over Sicily with the RAF, he had taken an air gunner's place when the gunner was wounded, and had shot down an empty fighter, a fact that used to be hushed up because war correspondents were supposed to be non-combatants. One of Clifford's colleagues, Ronald Monson of the Daily Telegraph, who described himself as a battlefront correspondent by choice and conviction, had swum the Euphrates during the Iraqi revolt to rescue a badly wounded British private. The two of them, having almost reached safety, were helped by an officer, who was later awarded the Distinguished Service Order. Eyewitnesses to the incident affirmed that Monson should be awarded the Victoria Cross, but again, because war correspondents were accredited to the forces and not as part of them, he was merely mentioned in dispatches. This sort of involvement with the military, the correspondents' understandable feeling that they were part of the fighting forces, had a powerful effect on the reporting of the North African campaign. To begin with, the war was reported very heavily in romantic terms. The enemy was depicted as brave, and in the case of the Italians, if not brave, then chivalrous. Hal Denny of the New York Times, who was taken prisoner and later exchanged, described Italians at Taranto pushing forward to offer British prisoners cigarettes, and wrote of the fine meal that they were given in the first-class section of the passenger liner Vittoria, to compensate for the crowded conditions in the Italian cruiser that had brought them from Benghazi. British troops began to sing the Africa Corps marching hit song Lily Marlene. Churchill saluted Rommel, "May I say, across the havoc of war, a great general," and the British public was inclined to treat the Desert Fox as its own hero. Rommel did not deserve it. According to Arvid Fredbergs, Behind the Steel Wall, he gave an interview in Berlin to neutral correspondents and described the British as cowards, whose methods of fighting were dishonorable. The arrival of General Bernard L. Montgomery as commander of the 8th Army, a man destined to become one of the more controversial generals of the Second World War, added the one factor missing from this romantic version of the war, a hero figure. Montgomery turned out to have many of the qualities that the other amazing characters of the desert, Lawrence of Arabia. He had Lawrence's keen sense of personal publicity, of getting himself in good press while appearing to hate it, of backing into the limelight. He, too, adopted unorthodox dress, had the same dislike of too much pomp and formality, and, above all, had the same sense of walking with destiny. In addition, Montgomery was an expert at the striking phrase suitable for headlines in tabloid papers, "Hit the enemy for 6," and at memorable, if somewhat bloodthirsty, exhortations to his troops, "Kill Germans, even Padres, 1 per weekday and 2 on Sundays." With Monty to write about, the neat, self-contained war in the desert was complete. What occurred when the vicious, impure war from the outside intruded on the desert saga is best illustrated by the treatment afforded Robert St. John. St. John of the United Pressman in Belgrade got caught up in the German push through Yugoslavia, Greece, and finally Crete. He was persuaded by a Greek correspondent, abetted by the British Embassy, to send a story about 300,000 British troops in Greece. The story turned out to be a fake. There were actually only 40,000 troops. He was bombed and strafed, and he was horrified by the slaughter he saw all around him. All Corinth was permeated by the smell of burning human flesh. Human flesh burns with a sickening sweet smell. It's a smell you never forget. He tried to give a lethal dose of morphine to a man whose hands had been blown off and whose intestines were hanging out, and he listened all one night to the whimpering of a 5-year-old girl whose right arm hung in black tattered shreds. In his progress southwards, always just one step ahead of the Germans, St. John became sick of his own calling. We were just leeches, reporters trying to suck headlines out of all this death and suffering. When he got to Cairo, St. John was amazed to learn that all had been written about Greece had come from completely misleading official dispatches, that the story of what had really happened had not been told, and that no one wanted to know. It seemed to be the tradition around the better places in Cairo that you mustn't let the sordid side of the war creep in. So St. John sat down at his typewriter and tried to put down all he had seen, the horror, the shambles, the sacrifices. When he finished, he was told he needed a stamp of approval on each page from the British military censor, the British naval censor, the RAF censor, the Egyptian civil censor, the British civil censors, and the telegraph office censor. But it was already 5 p.m., and the censors had gone home. However, he was determined that the world should know what had been happening, so he tracked down all of the censors, most of whom were in the Jazeera Club, except for the RAF one. The problem created by his absence was overcome by striking out all references to aircraft, or rather to the lack of them. Then St. John examined what the censors left of his story. He had written that the evacuation from Greece had not been another Dunkirk. The Greece evacuation had been much worse. The censor struck out the second clause, thus completely reversing St. John's meaning. He and his colleagues, by interviews and observation, had conservatively calculated Allied casualties at 20,000 killed, wounded, or captured. The censor had changed this to 3,000. In another story, St. John wrote about an ambulance driver who had been burned to death. The censor changed this to read Chap. He explained that correspondents should try their hardest not to make war seem horrible, and that death by being burned alive was not very pleasant to read about, was it? St. John argued that one reason for the debacle in Greece was the lack of aircraft. If Americans were made aware of the death and suffering in Europe, then they might stop buying automobiles and let aeroplanes be made instead. True, the censor said, absolutely true. Horror stories were fine for the United States, but Britain and the Empire must not be told how bad things were, and since the advent of radio it was impossible to keep stories for America and stories for the Empire nicely pigeonholed. The policy, therefore, was to keep a safe middle ground. St. John gave up, deciding that he was lucky to be able to send anything at all. He waited until he got back to the United States and told the whole story in a book. Censorship in the Middle East was not always as stupid as this, and after the United States had entered the war and the Allied invasion of North Africa took place, American censors showed in general a more liberal attitude to the correspondence. Ernie Pyle, later to be famous as the man who chronicled the war of the ordinary soldier, began his spell as a war correspondent in North Africa with a bitter attack on the United States policy, involving, as it did, disapproval of the French Committee of National Liberation with its plans for sweeping reforms and a new status for France's colonies, and recognition of none but the de facto government in France. In practice, this meant keeping in power Vichy officials who had collaborated with the Germans. Pyle and many others objected to this. "We have left in office most of the small fry officials that were put there by the Germans before we came," he wrote. "We are permitting fascist societies to continue to exist." The American censor passed this. The British censor, on the other hand, allowed Richard Hughes of the Sydney Daily Telegraph to report a damning interview with the Vichy government's resident general, Auguste Nogues, but struck out Hughes' reference to Nogues's abominable but appropriate halitosis. John Steinbeck, reporting for the New York Herald Tribune, wrote about 3 soldiers arrested for dealing in watches and about an American infantryman's deserting to get back to see the World Series, and the censor passed both stories. Drew Middleton, then with the AP, has said, "I covered the Kasserine battle, the Pass battle in Tunisia where the U.S. Second Corps got its ass kicked, wrote about it as a defeat, and the censor passed it." Fletcher Pratt has pointed out, however, that the censor did not permit the mention of any particular officer as being responsible for the setback. And perhaps the coverage of the political issues raised by the Allies' controversial complicity with the Vichy government in North Africa and their attitude toward the Free French, led by General de Gaulle, should be assessed in conjunction with the fact that, at the height of the affair, 6 out of every 10 Americans still had no idea who General de Gaulle was. As the campaign drew to a close, difficulties for the correspondents increased. "From the first to the last, we never saw a battle in the desert," Alan Moorhead wrote. "We were simply conscious of a great deal of dust, noise, and confusion. The only way we could gather a coherent picture was by driving hard from one headquarters to another and picking up the reports from the most forward units as they came through on the radio telephone. Then, when the worst was over, we went forward ourselves to observe the prisoners and the booty and hear the individual experiences of the soldiers. There was danger, communications bother, and often a grueling pace. It is worth recounting a day in the life of one correspondent so as to appreciate some of the problems. Richard Hughes, then of the Daily Express, and some American colleagues were watching the assault on Tunis when they learned that the city had fallen unexpectedly. Other correspondents were already there, and a courier plane would leave for Algiers with dispatches at dawn. Hughes and his colleagues bundled into an open car and drove madly into the city, with Hughes, who was large and impressive, standing on the back seat to try to convince the French General Traffic Police that he was a general. In one street, snipers would still be dangerous, and the next correspondent would be overwhelmed by people throwing flowers. At 8 p.m., Hughes had began a nightmare drive back to the correspondence camp. It was raining, the highway was choked with military traffic, and Hughes had to fight for space along a road still sown on either side with mines. The 12-mile journey took 6 hours. Hughes began writing at 2 a.m. and finished at 4 a.m., only to learn that the courier plane had been canceled and that dispatches from the other correspondents had already left by jeep. So Hughes and Dan DeLuche of the Associated Press drove to the airport and spent 2 hours begging Air Force to find them a plane going to Algiers. At dawn, a courier plane landed unexpectedly and agreed to take their stories. Then Hughes and DeLuce drove back to their base just in time to leave for the last push to Cape Bon. It was not easy to write distinguished reports under such circumstances. Moorhead is now considered one of the better correspondents of the period, and his piece from the early days about a tank battle, often quoted as a good example of his ability to combine with vivid description with tactical analysis. But it is difficult to say whether his North African work would be remembered had he not gone on after the war to become a famous and distinguished author. E. A. Montague, the Manchester Guardian, mixed fine prose with accuracy and insight, and was, Captain Basil Liddell Hart reported, a reliable source of information for anyone trying to probe for the truth and the half-truths of official information. Montague saw beyond the victories in North America and intelligently drew an unpopular but entirely accurate conclusion from the campaign. If the Allied armies are calling upon to fight the enemy in Europe, they will find only the grimmest resistance. Richard Dimbleby and Godfrey Talbot of the BBC showed that radio could provide, in certain circumstances, a sense of participation that much of newspaper reporting lacked. The live sound of British tanks going into action at Alamein, and the history skirl of the pipes as the 8th Army entered Tripoli are easily recalled, and the broadcaster's analysis was also first-rate. Charlie Wilmot of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation spent almost 3 months in Tobruk during the siege and later produced an excellent book on the subject. Wilmot was an unusual correspondent, little interested in reporting the war day by day, although he did this competently, but more broad issues, the wide survey, and analysis of the campaign from both the military and a political point of view. An early indication of talent that would make him a leading historian in the war. But for every Wilmot, there were 10 or 20 correspondents who preferred lines like these from a dispatch from Tobruk by a United Press correspondent, Jan H. Hindrich. A 23-year-old Australian, a former traveling salesman from Sydney, was one of a patrol of 7 who routed 40 Germans and brought back 1 prisoner. We tore into them with the bayonet. I got the shock of my life because not one of them wanted to fight. I bayoneted 4 of them myself, and my bayonet stuck in the 5th. He was the only bloke who showed any fight. He grabbed my rifle and pulled me down on top of him. I bashed several other Germans over the head with the butt of my rifle till it broke. Then I picked up a stone. One of them shouted, "Peace, it is peace!" And then in French, "S'il vous plaît." I must have killed about 12 of them altogether. There was simply this blood and guts reporting, and the unusual share of over-optimistic dispatches. General Sir Leslie Morshed, who commanded the Australian 9th Division in Tobruk, allowed Ronald Monson into the town during the siege because Morshed told Monson he had enough of lying correspondence and wanted someone he knew and trusted to report accurately. During the Crusader battle in November 1941, more German tanks were destroyed in correspondence reports than Rommel had ever possessed. When the British retreat toward Alexandria was halted, the BBC reported that the 8th Army was now safe because it had reached the Alamein line. Rifle Brigade officer wrote later, "When the troops heard this from the suave voice of the BBC announcer, they looked round at the empty desert and commented as only riflemen can." There was, in fact, no such thing as an Alamein line, but some correspondents managed to convey the impression that it stretched like some super Maginot line across the path of Rommel's advance. The reports actually influenced Rommel, and he delayed his attack to make preparations to cope with it. The reports did not impress British Army-based personnel in Alexandria, who moved to safer quarters with great speed, and they failed to convince the British Navy, which sailed out of Alexandria in such a hurry that it forgot to tell the army it was leaving. There was not a lot of reporting about looting, probably because many correspondents had discovered the joys of it themselves. "We looted Parmesan cheeses as big as cartwheels, and tins of strawberries, barrels of wine, and cases of chocolates, binoculars and typewriters, ceremonial swords, and Italian money galore," wrote Alan Moorhead. Even generals were not above a little theft. The sand and sun goggles that became part of Rommel's image as the Desert Fox he personally took from a captured British general. The other purely British battle with Germany, the campaign of the Bomber Command of the RAF, was perhaps the most grueling continuous operation in military history. It began in 1940, and in those dark days Churchill believed it held the secret of victory. He was convinced that raids of sufficient intensity could destroy Germany's morale, and so his war cabinet planned a campaign that abandoned the accepted practice of attacking the enemy's armed forces and, instead, made civilians the primary target. Night after night, RAF bombers in ever-increasing numbers struck throughout Germany, usually at working-class housing, because it was more densely packed. Berlin itself became the most bombed place on Earth at the time. In 1943, the United States Air Force joined the RAF in striking. It was hoped at the time crippling blows at German war industry and at Germany's will to continue the struggle. Yet it was all a delusion. German war production actually increased, and it was discovered too late that air raids made the German population more, not less, determined. 2 raids alone demonstrate this, and also show the part of contemporary war reporting played in perpetuating the delusion. The first is called the so-called Dam Busters raid, and the second is Operation Thunderclap, the attack on Dresden. The Dam Busters raid, on May 16th to 17th, 1943, by Wing Commander Guy Gibson and his pilots of the 617 Squadron, who was conceived as a way of breaching the 5 dams in western Germany, thus disrupting the German war effort. Using a special skipping bomb, 2 of the dams, the Mohn and the Eder, were breached, both to their foundations. Reception of the news in Britain was enthusiastic. The Daily Express headline read, "Floods roar down Ruhr Valley." The Daily Mirror said, "Hundreds of square miles of devastation have spread through the Ruhr, Germany's most densely populated industrial area, by the RAF's staggering attack on the Main and the Eder dams." Guy Gibson, a hero figure overnight, was awarded a Victoria Cross to add to his DSO and DFC, and was sent on a tour of the United States. He was killed later in action in 1944. A book on the raid, The Dam Busters, by Paul Brickhill, became Britain's biggest-selling war book and remains popular to this day. Millions have seen the film of the book, same title, and if the British public were asked to name the one wartime story it knew best, it would almost certainly plump for Guy Gibson and the Dam Busters. In 1972, after examining newly released Second World War official documents, the author and journalist Bruce Page wrote, "The truth about the raid is that it was a conjuring trick, virtually devoid of military significance. The skipping bomb, just a gimmick, and the real story of the raid was one of sloppy planning, narrow-minded enthusiasm, and misdirected courage. Apart from the air crews, the only people to emerge from the story with real credit are a handful of people in the Ministry of Economic Warfare, who also tried to calculate in advance whether the raid would damage German war economy. They calculated accurately that it would not, and they were ignored. The facts were that the Sorp, the one dam whose loss would have hit the German war effort, was attacked by only a token force from 617 Squadron, and bombs were not effective against it anyway. The breaching of the Möhne and Eder dams caused flood damage to agricultural land, of which Germany had no lack. It did not affect hydroelectricity because the Möhne had only negligible electrical capacity and the Eder had none. The largest single group killed in the raid was not Germans but several hundred Allied servicemen, Russian POWs who had been confined below the Möhne Dam. The results of the raid, the official historian wrote in 1961, were, quote, disappointing, end quote. But the myth, born in the rapturous press reporting of the raid, triumphed over the reality. The difficulty for newspapers was that they had no way of checking, even if they had been skeptical, which they were not, whether the RAF's claims of the successes of the bombing raids were justified. The RAF was extremely reluctant to carry correspondents on missions, for the simple reason that there was little room in a loaded bomber for a non-combatant, especially one who might get in the way. Although reading them now, one account of a bombing raid is much like another. At the time, correspondents felt that they were missing good stories and chafed at the ban. Finally, in 1943, January, after a long struggle with the Air Ministry, 6 reporters representing the British, American, and Dominion press, and 2 broadcasters, 1 British and 1 American, were allowed to go with the RAF on a night raid on Berlin. A month later, after taking a short course in high-altitude flying, 5 others joined the United States 8th Air Force in raids over Germany. Throughout the war, while area bombing attacks on the civilian population were war cabinet policy, Britain was officially claiming that she was bombing only military targets. German and some neutral correspondents were writing that the RAF was systematically bombing civilian areas, but these stories were dismissed in Britain and America as propaganda. The Allied correspondents who went on raids in 1943 were the first to have an opportunity to check the truth of this matter. True, it is difficult, in a bomber at high altitude and under attack, to do much more than take the crew's word for where the bombs are falling, but in most cases, correspondents went out of their way to stress that they were not falling on civilian targets. For example, James MacDonald of the New York Times, in an exciting story of an RAF raid on Berlin, wrote, "I am not permitted to divulge the various targets, but I can assure readers that they were picked for the special purpose of crippling Berlin's war effort." Ed Murrow of CBS was closer to the mark when he reported, on a later Berlin raid, "The work done last night was a massive blow of retribution, and this isn't pleasant kind of warfare. The men doing it speak of a job. Men die while in the sky, while others are roasted alive in their cellars. This is a calculated, remorseless campaign of destruction." Murrow later saw the effects of bombing from the ground. On October 22, 1945, he was in Leipzig and broadcast this report. "The shelling had caused no fire. There was nothing left to burn. The city had been killed by bombing. It was merely a dusty, uneven desert." By 1944, British bombers were suffering such losses at the hands of German night raid pilots that it was the Battle of Britain in reverse. German night fighter pilots. By 1944, British bombers were suffering such losses at the hands of British night fighter pilots that it was the Battle of Britain in reverse. RAF crews dropped enormous quantities of bombs in the North Sea, and an official report to Bomber Command wrote of them as having balked the jump. All this time, correspondents were fighting a running battle with the Air Ministry over strengths and losses. The ministry deliberately tried to conceal figures by using phrases like "a strong force" and "a very strong force," and by talking at infrequent intervals of losses not exceeding an average of, say, 5%. Correspondents argued that if the losses on a particular raid had been, say, 40 planes, and if this was the average loss of 5%, they were justified in estimating the total number taking part of that raid as 800. But in their arguing their right to say this, the correspondents missed the real point, that the Air Ministry was concealing from them the ratio of losses of planes to numbers taking part, not to avoid encouraging the enemy, but to prevent the reader from losing faith in bombing as a means of waging war. So, unquestioned and unchecked, the theory of area bombing proceeded in 1945 to its logical conclusion. Thunderclap, a catastrophic blow against a single city, a raid so great and so terrible that it would precipitate the end of the war before Hitler could deploy his new V weapons. Dresden was chosen, and on the night of February 13th, 1945, while Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met at Yalta, the RAF struck at the city, crowded with refugees from the Russian advance, and dropped 750,000 incendiary bombs, which created a firestorm, an artificial tornado in which air is sucked in to the fire center at an ever-increasing speed. At Dresden, winds approaching 100 miles an hour swept debris and people into a fire center where the temperature exceeded 1,000 degrees centigrade. The flames ate everything organic, everything that would burn. People died by the thousands, cooked, incinerated, or suffocated. Then American planes came the next day to machine gun survivors as they struggled to the banks of the Elbe. Precise casualty figures will never be known. German authorities stopped counting when the known dead reached 25,000 and 35,000 were still missing. Some post-war sources put the number of dead from 100,000 to 130,000, which would greatly exceed the number killed in the atom bombing of Hiroshima and would make the 380 killed at Coventry or the Blitz total 51,500 seem small indeed. Ministry defense records show that there were no war correspondents with the planes over Dresden, and there were no eyewitness accounts of the bombing except for those of a few air crews interviewed on their return, and they had been given various concocted explanations as to why they were bombing the city. They were attacking the German army headquarters, destroying an arms dump, knocking out an industrial area, or even wiping out a large poison gas plant. Both British and American newspapers correctly assessed the raid as one of the most devastating 24-hour periods of aerial warfare ever known. British newspapers at first accepted and published without query the official line that Dresden was an important military target. Dresden was merely a staging center for 500,000 refugees from Silesia. The marshalling yards were not even attacked. There were no ammunition workshops and factories, only a small works making optical lenses for gun sights. The truth first came out in Sweden. At 10:15 p.m. on February 15th, a Swedish news bulletin transmitted in Danish to occupied Denmark said that the death toll in Dresden was already between 20,000 and 35,000. Newspapers in Switzerland and other neutral countries began to print horrifying accounts of the raid. Then, on February 17th, after a briefing at Allied Supreme Headquarters in Paris, the Associated Press reported throughout the United States, Allied air chiefs have made the long-awaited decision to adopt deliberate terror bombings of German population centers as a ruthless expedient hastening of Hitler's doom. This decision, of course, had been taken long before, and the bombing of the German population centers had been going on for nearly 3 years. In Britain, the authorities imposed a total ban on the publication of the AP Dispatch, and it was not until March 5th, nearly 3 weeks after the event, that the Manchester Guardian published an account suggesting that the bombing of Dresden had killed large numbers of civilian refugees in particularly unpleasant manner. There was, however, only one prompt, comprehensive, and factual report at this stage of what had happened in Dresden. It was a German one, written by Rudolf Sparing, war correspondent for the German Overseas News Agency. After a short but accurate description of the raid and an early estimate of casualties, Sparing wrote, The Dresden catastrophe is without precedent. In the inner town, not a single block of buildings, not a single detached building, remains intact or even capable of reconstruction. The town area is devoid of human life. A great city has been wiped from the map of Europe.